So this week in the Sacred Gathering, we're going to continue looking at kind of the bones of our community, the structure we use in which to kind of structure our time and our energy. So we have kind of worked our way out along this thing. So we started with worship. We've looked at kind of the next sphere out, service and hospitality. We are now into neighborhood development, and next week we will finish it off with community organizing. So the neighborhood development piece, let me just start by reading this kind of definition we have on here. Um, Neighborhood development is not so much a core value as it is an expression of the kingdom way of being in our context of Colorado Springs. God created us with a need for community, but we often mistake community for something we opt in and out of as we feel like participating in it or don't. That's not kingdom community, it's consumerism. We create spaces, events in our neighborhoods so people can experience actual community, blessing them as beloved to God and giving them an invitation deeper into the kingdom. So, this one, in a lot of ways, as I said, there's nothing particularly theological about the way we do this. We are doing it based on kind of an understanding of God, which we'll look at in just a second. But this idea of neighborhood development, particularly, I think is just a way of expressing the kingdom of God, which is this alternate way of being, this alternate way of understanding that God is ultimately in charge, not our cultural and political expressions are not ultimately in charge. And so neighborhood development is just simply us trying to respond to that call of God's kingdom and living into this other way of being within the context we have here in Colorado Springs, kind of the urban suburban mix that we have here with our community members. So let me talk real quickly about kind of where our theology on this comes from, why our understanding is that way it is, and then we'll look at kind of why that is expressed in kind of neighborhood development. So our kind of verse we're spending time with comes out of John 1. This is a very famous passage. I'm going to be reading it from the Message translation, just because I think that Peterson does a really nice job of kind of expressing a lot of the things we're trying to do in this, very heady poetic passage. He kind of brings it a little more down to earth in a way I think that's more practical for what we're talking about right now. So starting in John 1, chapter 1. The Word was first, the Word present to God, God present to the Word was God, in readiness for God from day one. Everything was created through him, nothing, not one thing, came into being without him. What came into existence was life, and the life was light to live by. The life light blazed out of the darkness couldn't put it out. The life light was the real thing. Every person entering life, he brings into light. He was in the world was there through him, and yet the world didn't even notice. He came to his own people, but they didn't want him. But whoever did want him, who believed he was who he claimed and would do as he said, he made to be their true selves, their child of God selves. These are the God begotten, not flesh begotten, not blood begotten, not sex begotten. The Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. We saw the glory with our own eyes, the one-of-a-kind glory, like Father, like Son, generous inside and out, true from start to finish. We all live off his generous bounty, gift after gift after gift. We got the basics from Moses, and then this exuberant giving and receiving, this endless knowing and understanding, all this that came through Jesus the Messiah. No one has ever seen God, not so much as a glimpse, this one-of-a-kind God expression, who exists at the very heart of the Father, has made him plain as day. So one of the things I just love about that passage is it's just such a concrete expression reminding us of who Jesus was and kind of how he approached his own mission in life. Jesus was not just a teacher, is our belief. Jesus was not just a religious thinker. Jesus was, in fact, God incarnate. And so this view that God is not far away, that God is hiding off somewhere, is very different than most kind of religious understandings, including, sadly, a lot of people who are following this God, who are following Jesus, still have this understanding that God is far away and he's sitting back somewhere in his holiness and his glory. And he's really hoping that we will, in fact, come to him. We'll try really hard, we'll clean up our lives, and we will work our way towards being in God's presence. He's waiting back, kind of hoping it'll all work out. That version, that story of God is really hard to square with what we actually see in this passage and other places in the Bible, right? God is not sitting back, content and happy. We're reminded Jesus was with God. Jesus is God. And yet he chose to come to us in humanity. He chose to come to fallen humanity, knowing full well what was going to cost him, that he would be unappreciated, that he would be unjustly killed eventually, that he would in fact have to carry the burden of sin and death for us because that's who we are. And so if that is kind of the founder of the kingdom, if that is who God actually is, not a God who kind of hangs back where it's safe and comfortable, but in fact leaves comfort and safety for the sake of loving others to help them along, we think that that is the model that we as the church have been called to try and do. And it can be very easy in this day and age where we have beautiful buildings, where we have clergy with great educations, where we have some beautiful music and spaces like that, right? Where we have some really strong, good communities where people take care of each other, to basically have the attitude of still is come to us and we will teach you about God. We will show you what community it can actually be like, rather than, as I described in here, our version of community, which is pretty consumeristic in this culture largely. A community is something that I get out, somewhere I can go to get something out of. And if I'm feeling it, great. And if I'm not feeling connected, I don't. I think the community that God is intending on creating is a very different one. And I think a lot of our churches, actually reflect that community. People take good care of one another in a way that is hopefully unique in our culture, not hopefully in that we don't want people taken care of, but hopefully that we follow a sacrificial God, and therefore we hope that our communities are even better at taking care of one another, at loving one another, just as our founder did, right? And yet, I think at this point in our culture, a couple hundred years into this kind of experiment where the church became a major cultural power, a couple thousand years, I'd say. And, nowadays, at the point where this is broken down, a lot of people do not want there to be a strong correlation between culture and the church itself. And I will confess, I'm one of them. I don't think we were ever meant to have power. I don't think we were ever meant to dictate the terms to a culture. We have always been at our best as the church, I think, when we are more lowly, when we are more humble, when we can actually allow God to be God and trusting God and his ways of provision, rather than providing for ourselves, whether that's through economic power, whether that's through traditional violence, whether that's through the power that comes with cultural influence. All of those things, again, are, I think, very difficult to hold, and to hold rightly and justly with how God desires us to do things. And so we find ourselves culturally in a place where hopefully our churches are good, healthy expressions of the kingdom and the community. And yet we are still largely asking a very cynical and skeptical culture to come to us, to talk like us, to think like us, to come and experience our culture on our terms. And again, I just find that very hard to square with what I just read. The fact that Jesus came to us. He left those places of safety and comfort, the ultimate one, heaven, of course, and God's presence, to be among humanity. And so we are trying here at the Wayfarers Chapel, in our own flawed human way, to do just that, right? I still think worship and connecting with God is at the very core of what we do. I still think that people want to serve, people want to experience hospitality in our culture, and I think those are really important ways to express it. But in this community, we added a kind of an extra ring, and I think that's because sometimes those are really big steps to ask. People step into God's presence for the way we talk about God, is just kind of different. We've experienced God and we talk about God very differently. And so we think that there's another layer of stepping out and kind of going to people where they are at. And I think a real opportunity for this is, of course, just in the places we live, our neighborhoods. Um, Many of us are going to be living in either kind of the urban core or suburban settings, both of which kind of have an assumption that my home, my place of residence, is somewhere that is separated from other kind of more public aspects of life, right? These are the places that I can come to get away. These are the places that I get my own little kingdom in some ways. And that's kind of the goal, right? If I work hard, I get to retreat to these spaces. And of course, we recognize that life is better together, so we have some public events. Hopefully, most of our neighborhoods have something going on where people can get to know one another, but it tends to be pretty superficial. We don't tend to really need one another the way in kind of the middle class and the upper classes, the way people often need to rely on one another in the community overall, as they do in kind of more lower class neighborhoods and most of the world, where we have much stronger kinship networks or tribal networks, villages, etc. That the assumption is just kind of that people will be taking care of one another. And so, again, in this culture, in this set of assumptions, whether it's suburban or urban, that, you know, what I believe is left for me, my home is something that is, sacred and mine, and I only kind of go out and interact with community on my own terms as long as I'm getting something out of it. I think we have an opportunity as kingdom people, as God's people. God's again and again desires to bless, right? He desires, as we saw Jesus do, he walked into so many different situations and just made it better. The party came with him. People felt connected in a way that they never could. People felt forgiven and a part of the community who were pariahs for one reason or another in other ways. And so I think there's an opportunity, and that's why we talk so much about neighborhood development. The people around you should be blessed. And I think one of the easiest ways to bless for many of us in many settings is to create spaces, whether that's at a public event, whether that's to organize things, whether it's to attend the things that are already going there, with the assumption, how do I help? How do I serve? How do I bless what is here? Because again, I think that's what Jesus did. Everywhere he went, people were thrilled to have him there because he was all about extending that goodness of God, of the blessing. And sometimes that did require challenging as well, right? There were things in the way of the good life that God is calling us into. There were things in the way of this other kingdom, this other way of being, which was not judgmental, which did invite the outsider and the outcast into something. It was a way of living life together that was very different and unique, even in a more communal kind of tribal family culture that Jesus lived in. Even then, what he was doing was very radical because of just the generosity we heard about in that spirit. And so we do neighborhood development. We've done a lot of different things over the years. We've organized events. We've done cleanups. We've worked with groups doing creek cleanups for many years. We served coffee down in the park, providing this amazing space where people had conversation, got to know their neighbors. And so one just core expression of that alternate way of being in the world, one that I think makes sense in our cultural context that tends towards isolation and not really understanding community, is just seeing the neighborhoods we live in, the places we be, as opportunities for that invitation, that story that God is near, not far away, that God is not all about judging people and making people feel bad about themselves, but inviting them into wholeness and healing, which is often can be very challenging to kind of this fragmented, selfish way of life that we are in. But we're not going to convince people of that by telling them to come to us and experience it. We need to take this message, this way of being in the world, out to them. And so that's what we're trying to do in both this neighborhood development, very specifically looking at the places we live, the contours of life in the suburbs or in an urban environment, and saying, okay, what does it look like for the kingdom here? We'll kind of continue this theme in the next one when we look at community organizing. But both of those kind of share this kind of core idea of where we are matters, and that is how the gospel is going to be expressed. Another way he puts it sometimes in Eugene Peterson is says, the gospel always needs to have an address. And so we have addresses. So that is where we want to live out the gospel. And a lot of the time for us, that is through neighborhood development.